Chapter 24 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The campaign quickens. Mr. Jarvis was as good as his word. Early in the afternoon, he made his appearance at the office of Peaceful Moments, his forelock more than usually well oiled in honor of the occasion, and his right coat pocket bulging in a manner that betrayed to the initiated eye the presence of his trusty canister. With him, in addition, he brought a long, thin young man, who wore under his brown tweed coat a blue and red striped sweater. Whether he brought him as an ally in case of need, or merely as a kindred soul with whom he might commune during his vigil, did not appear. Pugsy, startled out of his wonted calm by the arrival of this distinguished company, gazed after the pair as they passed into the inner office with protruding eyes. John greeted the allies warmly and explained Smith's absence. Mr. Jarvis listened to the story with interest and introduced his colleague. "Thought I'd let him chase along. Long Otto's his moniker." "Sure," said John. "The more the merrier. Take a seat. You'll find cigars over there. You won't mind my not talking for the moment? There's a wad of work to clear up." This was an overstatement. He was comparatively free of work, press day having only just gone by. But he was keenly anxious to avoid conversation on the subject of cats, of his ignorance of which Mr. Jarvis's appearance had suddenly reminded him. He took up an old proof-sheet and began to glance through it, frowning thoughtfully. Mr. Jarvis regarded the paraphernalia of literature on the table with interest. So did Long Otto, who, however, being a man of silent habit, made no comment. Throughout the séance and the events which followed, he confined himself to an occasional grunt. He seemed to lack other modes of expression. "Is dis where you's right up to pieces for de poiper?" inquired Mr. Jarvis. "This is the spot," said John. "On busy mornings you could hear our brains buzzing in Madison Square Garden. Oh, one moment." He rose and went into the outer office. "Pugsy," he said, "do you know Broster Street?" "Sure." "Could you find out for me exactly when the man comes round collecting the rents?" "Surest thing you know. I knows a kid what knows another kid what lives there." "Then go and do it now. And after you've found out, you can take the rest of the day off." "Me for that," said Master Maloney with enthusiasm. "I'll take me Goyle to the Bronx Zoo." "Your girl? I didn't know you'd got a girl, Pugsy. I always imagined you as one of those strong, stern, blood and iron men who despised girls. Who is she?" "Aw, she's a kid," said Pugsy. "Her pa runs a delicatessen shop down our street. She ain't a bad mutt," added the ardent swain. "I'm her steady." "Well, mind you send me a card for the wedding, and if $2 would be a help." "Sure ting. Thanks, boss. You're all right." It had occurred to John that the less time Pugsy spent in the outer office during the next few days, the better. The lull in the warfare could not last much longer, and at any moment a visit from Spider Riley and his adherents might be expected. Their probable first move in such an event would be to knock Master Maloney on the head to prevent his giving warning of their approach. Events proved that he had not been mistaken. He had not been back in the inner office for more than a quarter of an hour when there came from without the sound of stealthy movements. The handle of the door began to revolve slowly and quietly. The next moment 3 figures tumbled into the room. It was evident that they had not expected to find the door unlocked, and their absence of reticence when they applied their weight had surprising effects. 2 of the 3 did not pause in their career till they cannoned against the table. The third checked himself by holding the handle. John got up coolly. "Come right in," he said. "What can we do for you?" It had been too dark on the other occasion of his meeting with the 3 pointers to take note of their faces, though he fancied that he had seen the man holding the door handle before. The others were strangers. They were all exceedingly unprepossessing in appearance. There was a pause. The 3 marauders had become aware of the presence of Mr. Jarvis and his colleague, and the meeting was causing them embarrassment, which may have been due in part to the fact that both had produced and were toying meditatively with ugly-looking pistols. Mr. Jarvis spoke. "Well," he said, "what's doing?" The man to whom the question was directly addressed appeared to have some difficulty finding a reply. He shuffled his feet and looked at the floor. His 2 companions seemed equally at a loss. "Going to start anything?" enquired Mr. Jarvis casually. The humor of the situation suddenly tickled John. The embarrassment of the uninvited guests was ludicrous. "You've just dropped in for a quiet chat, is that it?" he said. "Well, we're all delighted to see you. The cigars are on the table. Draw up your chairs." Mr. Jarvis opposed the motion. He drew slow circles in the air with his revolver. "Say, you's had best beat it, see?" Long Otto grunted sympathy with the advice. "And you's had best go back to Spider Riley," continued Mr. Jarvis, "and tell him there ain't nothin' doin' in the way of roughhouse with this gent here. And you can tell the Spider," went on Bat with growing ferocity, "that next time he gets fresh and starts into shootin' up my dance joint, I'll bite the head off'n him, see? That goes. If he thinks his little 2x4 crowd can git away with the Groove Street, he's got another guess comin'. And don't you forget this gent here and me is friends, and anyone that starts anything with this gent is going to find trouble. Does that go? Beat it." He jerked his shoulder in the direction of the door. The delegation then withdrew. "Thanks," said John. "I'm much obliged to you both. You're certainly there with the goods as fighting editors. I don't know what I should have done without you." "Ah, gee," said Mr. Jarvis, handsomely dismissing the matter. Long Otto kicked the leg of a table and grunted. Pugsy Maloney's report on the following morning was entirely satisfactory. Rents were collected in Broster Street on Thursdays. Nothing could have been more convenient, for that very day happened to be Thursday. "I rubbered around," said Pugsy, "and done the sloot act, and it's this way. There's a fellow blows in every Thursday about 6 o'clock, and then it's up to the folks to dig down into their jeans for the stuff, or out they goes before supper. I got that from my kid friend what knows a kid what lives there. And say, he has it pretty fierce, that kid, the kid what lives there. He's a wop kid, and Italian, and he's in bad 'cause his pa comes over from Italy to work on the subway." "I don't see why that puts him in bad," said John wonderingly. "You don't construct your stories very well, Pugsy. You start at the end, and then go back to any part which happens to appeal to you, and eventually wind up at the beginning. Why is this kid in bad? Because his father has come to work on the subway? Why, sure, because his pa got fired and swatted the foreman went on to Coco, and they gives him 20 days. So the kid's all alone, and no one to pay the rent. I see, said John. Well, come along with me and introduce me, and I'll look after that. At 5:30, John closed the office for the day, and, armed with a big stick, and conducted by Master Maloney, made his way to Broster Street. To reach it, it was necessary to pass through a section of the enemy's country, but the perilous passage was safely negotiated. The expedition reached its unsavory goal intact. The Wop Kid inhabited a small room at the very top of the building, halfway down the street. He was out when John and Pugsy arrived. It was not an abode of luxury, the tenement. They had to feel their way up the stairs in almost pitch darkness. Most of the doors were shut, but one on the second floor was ajar. Through the opening John had a glimpse of a number of women sitting on upturned boxes. The floor was covered with little heaps of linen. All the women were sewing. Stumbling in the darkness, John almost fell against the door. None of the women looked up at the noise. In Broster Street, time was evidently money. On the top floor, Pugsy halted before the open door of an empty room. The architect, in this case, had apparently given rein to a passion for originality, for he had constructed the apartment without a window of any sort whatever. The entire stock of air used by the occupants came through a small opening over the door. It was a warm day, and John recoiled hastily. "Is this the kid's room?" he said. "I guess the corridor's good enough for me to wait in. What the owner of this place wants," he went on reflectively, "is scalping. Well, we'll do it in the paper if we can't in any other way. Is this your kid?" A small boy had appeared. He seemed surprised to see visitors. Pugsy undertook to do the honors. Pugsy, as interpreter, was energetic, but not wholly successful. He appeared to have a fixed idea that the Italian language was one easily mastered by the simple method of saying da instead of the, and adding a final to any word that seemed to him to need one. "Say, kid," he began, "has the rent-a-man come yet, da?" The black eyes of the Wop Kid clouded. He gesticulated and said something in his native language. "He hasn't got next," reported Master Maloney. "He can't git on to me curbs. These Wop kids is all boneheads. Say, kid, look a here." He walked to the door, rapped on it smartly, and, assuming a look of extreme ferocity, stretched out his hand and thundered, "Unbelta, slip me da stuff." The Wop Kid's puzzlement in the face of this address became pathetic. "This," said John, deeply interested, "is getting exciting. Don't give in, Pugsy. I guess the trouble is that your too perfect Italian accent is making the kid homesick." Master Maloney made a gesture of disgust. "Untrue. These Dagos makes me tired. They don't know enough to go upstairs and take the elevated. Beat it, you mutt," he observed with moody displeasure, accompanying the word with a gesture which conveyed its own meaning. The Wop Kid, plainly glad to get away, slipped down the stairs like a shadow. Pugsy shrugged his shoulders. "Boss," he said resignedly, "it's up to yous." John reflected. "It's all right," he said. Of course, if the collector had been here, the kid wouldn't be. All I've got to do is wait." He peered over the banisters into the darkness below. "Not that it's not enough," he said, "for of all the poisonous places I ever met, this is the worst. I wish whoever built it had thought to put in a few windows. His idea of ventilation was apparently to leave a hole about the size of a lima bean and let the thing go at that." "I guess there's a door onto the roof somewhere," suggested Pugsy. "At the joint where I lives, there is." His surmise proved correct. At the end of the passage, a ladder, nailed against the wall, ended in a large square opening through which was visible, if not that narrow strip of blue which prisoners call the sky, at any rate a tall brick chimney and a clothesline covered with garments that waved lazily in the breeze. John stood beneath it, looking up. "Well," he said, "this isn't much, but it's better than nothing. I suppose the architect of this place was one of those fellows who don't begin to appreciate air till it's thick enough to scoop chunks out of with a spoon. It's an acquired taste, I guess, like Limburger cheese. And now, Pugsy, old scout, you had better beat it. There may be a rough house here any minute now." Pugsy looked up, indignant. "Beat it?" "While your shoe leather's good," said John firmly. "This is no place for a minister's son. Take it from me." "I want to stop and pipe the fun," objected Master Maloney. "What fun?" "I guess you ain't here to play ball," surmised Pugsy shrewdly, eyeing the big stick. "Never mind why I'm here," said John. "Beat it. I'll tell you all about it tomorrow." Master Maloney prepared reluctantly to depart. As he did so, there was a sound of well-shod feet on the stairs, and a man in a snuff-coloured suit, wearing a brown Homburg hat, and carrying a small note-book in one hand, walked briskly up the stairs. His whole appearance proclaimed him to be the long-expected collector of rents. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cornered. He did not see John for a moment, and had reached the door of the room when he became aware of a presence. He turned in surprise. He was a smallish, pale-faced man with protruding eyes and teeth which gave him a certain resemblance to a rabbit. "Hello," he said. "Welcome to our city," said John, stepping unostentatiously between him and the stairs. Master Maloney, who had taken advantage of the interruption to edge back into the centre of things, now appeared to consider the question of his departure permanently shelved. He sidled to a corner of the landing and sat down on an empty soap-box, with the air of a dramatic critic at the opening night of a new play. The scene looked good to him. It promised interesting developments. He was an earnest student of the drama, as exhibited in the theatres of the East Side, and few had ever applauded the hero of Escaped from Sing Sing, or hissed the villain of Nellie the Beautiful Cloak Model with more fervour. He liked his drama to have plenty of action, and to his practised eye this one promised well. There was a set expression on John's face which suggested great things. His pleasure was abruptly quenched. John, placing a firm hand on his collar, led him to the top of the stairs and pushed him down. Beat it, he said. The rent collector watched these things with a puzzled eye. He now turned to John. Say, seen anything of the wops that live here? He inquired. My name's Gooch. I've come to take the rent. John nodded. I don't think there's much chance of your seeing them tonight, he said. The father, I hear, is in prison. You won't get any rent out of him. Then it's outside for theirs, said Mr. Gooch, definitely. What about the kid? Said John. Where's he to go? That's up to him. Nothing to do with me. I'm only acting under orders from up top. Whose orders? The gent who owns this joint. Who is he? Suspicion crept into the protruding eyes of the rent collector. Say, he demanded, who are you, anyway, and what do you think you're doing here? That's what I'd like to know. What do you want with the name of the owner of this place? What business is it of yours? I'm a newspaper man. I guessed you were, said Gooch with triumph. You can't bluff me. Well, it's no good, sonny. I've nothing for you. You'd better chase off and try something else. He became more friendly. Say, though, he said, I just guessed you were from some paper. I wish I could give you a story, but I can't. I guess it's this Peaceful Moments business that's been and put your editor onto this joint, ain't it? Say, though, that's a queer thing, that paper. Why, only a few weeks ago, it used to be a sort of take-home and read to the kids affair. A friend of mine used to buy it regular. And then suddenly it comes out with a regular whoop and starts knocking these tenements and boosting Kid Brady and all that. Gets past me. All I know is it's begun to get this place talked about. Why, you see for yourself how it is. Here's your editor sending you down to get a story about it. But say, those Peaceful Moments guys are taking big risks. I tell you straight they are. And I know. I happen to be wise to a thing or two about what's going on the other side. And I tell you, there's going to be something doing if they don't cut it out quick. The fellow who owns this place isn't the man to sit still and smile. He's going to get busy. Say, what paper do you come from? Peaceful Moments, said John. For a moment, the inwardness of the information did not seem to come home to Mr. Gooch. Then it hit him. He spun round. John was standing squarely between him and the stairs. Hey, what's this? Demanded Mr. Gooch nervously. The light was dim in the passage, but it was sufficiently light to enable him to see John's face, and it did not reassure him. I'll soon tell you, said John. First, however, let's get this business of the kid's rent settled. Take it out of this and give me the receipt. He pulled out a bill. Curse his rent, said Mr. Gooch. Let me pass. Soon, said John. Business before pleasure. How much does the kid have to pay for the privilege of suffocating in this infernal place? As much as that. Well, give me a receipt, and then we can get on to more important things. Let me pass. Receipt, said John laconically. Mr. Gooch looked at the big stick, then scribbled a few words in his notebook and tore out the page. John thanked him. I will see that it reaches him, he said. And now, will you kindly tell me the name of the man for whom you collected the money? Let me pass, bellowed Mr. Gooch. I'll bring an action against you for assault and battery. Playing a fool game like this. Get away from those stairs. There has been no assault and battery yet, said John. Well, are you going to tell me? Mr. Gooch shuffled restlessly. John leaned against the banisters. "As you said moments ago," he observed, "the staff of Peaceful Moments is taking big risks. I knew it before you told me. I have had practical demonstration of the fact. And that is why this Broster Street thing has got to be finished quick. We can't afford to wait. So I am going to have you tell me this man's name right now." "Help!" yelled Mr. Gooch. The noise died away, echoing against the walls. No answering cry came from below. Custom had staled the piquancy of such cries in Broster Street. If anybody heard it, nobody thought the matter worth investigation. "If you do that again," said John, "I'll break you in half. Now then, I can't wait much longer. Get busy." He looked huge and sinister to Mr. Gooch, standing there in the uncertain light. It was very lonely on the top floor, and the rest of the world seemed infinitely far away. Mr. Gooch wavered. He was loyal to his employer, but he was still more loyal to Mr. Gooch. "Well?" said John. There was a clatter on the stairs of one running swiftly, and Pugsy Maloney burst into view. For the first time since John had known him, Pugsy was openly excited. "Say, boss," he cried, "dey's comin'." "What? Who?" "Why, dem. I seen dem 3-pointers, Spider Riley and—" He broke off with a yelp of surprise. Mr. Gooch had seized his opportunity, and had made his dash for safety. With a rush he dived past John, nearly upsetting Pugsy, who stood in his path, and sprang down the stairs. Once he tripped, but recovered himself, and in another instant only the faint sound of his hurrying footsteps reached them. John had made a movement as if to follow, but the full meaning of Pugsy's words came upon him, and he stopped. "Spider Riley?" he said. "I guess it was Spider Riley," said Pugsy excitedly. "Dey called him Spider. I guess dey piped you's comin' in here. Gee, it's pretty fierce, boss, dis. What you's goin' to do?" "Where did you see them, Pugsy?" "On de street just outside. Dere was a bunch of dem spielin' together, and I hears dem say you was in here. There ain't no ways out but the front, so dey ain't hurryin'. They just reckon to pike along upstairs, peekin' into each room till they find you. And there's a bunch of dem going to wait on de street, in case you's beat it past them down the stairs while the other guys is rubbering for you's. Gee, ain't dis the limit?" And John stood thinking. His mind was working rapidly. Suddenly he smiled. "It's all right, Pugsy," he said. "It looks bad, but I see a way out. I'm going up that ladder there, and through the trap-door onto the roof. I shall be all right there. If they find me, they can only get at me one at a time, and while I'm there, here's what I want you to do." "Shall I go for the cops, boss?" "No, not the cops. Do you know where Jude Dawson lives?" The light of intelligence began to shine in Master Maloney's face. His eye glistened with approval. This was strategy of the right sort. "I can ask round," he said. "I'll soon find him, all right." "Do, and as quick as you can. And when you've found him, tell him that his old chum, Spider Riley, is here with the rest of his crowd. And now I'd better be getting up on my perch. Off you go, Pugsy, my son, and don't take a week about it. Goodbye." Pugsy vanished, and John, going to the ladder, climbed out onto the roof with his big stick. He looked about him. The examination was satisfactory. The trapdoor appeared to be the only means of access to the roof. and between this roof and that of the next building there was a broad gulf. The position was practically impregnable. Only one thing could undo him, and that was if the enemy should mount to the next roof and shoot from there. And even then he would have cover in the shape of the chimney. It was a pity that the trap opened downward, for he had no means of securing it, and was obliged to allow it to hang open. But except for that, his position could hardly have been stronger. As yet, there was no sound of the enemy's approach. Evidently, as Pugsy had said, they were conducting the search, room by room, in a thorough and leisurely way. He listened with his ear close to the open trap-door, but could hear nothing. A startled exclamation directly behind him brought him to his feet in a flash, every muscle tense. He whirled his stick above his head as he turned, ready to strike, then let it fall with a clatter, for there, a bare yard away, stood Betty. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Journey's End. The capacity of the human brain for surprise, like that of the human body for pain, is limited. For a single instant, a sense of utter unreality struck John like a physical blow. The world flickered before his eyes, and the air seemed full of strange noises. Then, quite suddenly, these things passed, and he found himself looking at her with a total absence of astonishment, mildly amused in some remote corner of his brain at his own calm. It was absurd, he told himself, that he should be feeling as if he had known of her presence there all the time. Yet it was so. If this were a dream, he could not be taking the miracle more as a matter of course. Joy at the sight of her he felt, keen and almost painful, but no surprise. The shock had stunned his sense of wonder. She was wearing a calico apron over her dress, an apron that had evidently been designed for a large woman. Swathed in its folds, she suggested a child playing at being grown up. Her sleeves were rolled back to the elbow, and her slim arms dripped with water. Strands of brown hair were blowing loose in the evening breeze. To John she had never seemed so bewitchingly pretty. He stared at her till the pallor of her face gave way to a warm red glow. As they stood there, speechless, there came from the other side of the chimney, softly at first, then swelling, the sound of a child's voice, raised in a tentative wail. Betty started violently. The next moment she was gone, and from the unseen parts beyond the chimney came the noise of splashing water. And at the same instant, through the trap, came a trampling of feet and the sound of whispering. The enemy had reached the top. John was conscious of a remarkable exhilaration. He felt insanely light-hearted. He laughed aloud at the thought that until then he had completely forgotten the very existence of these earnest seekers after his downfall. He threw back his head and shouted. There was something so ridiculous in their assumption that they mattered to a man who had found Betty again. He thrust his head down through the trap to see what was going on. The dark passage was full of indistinct forms, gathered together in puzzled groups. The mystery of the vanished object of their pursuit was being discussed in hoarse whispers. Suddenly there was an excited shout, then a rush of feet. John drew back his head and waited, gripping his stick. Voices called to each other in the passage below. "The roof! On top of the roof! He's beatin' it for the roof!" Feet shuffled on the stone floor. The voices ceased abruptly, and then, like a jack-in-the-box, there popped through the trap a head and shoulders. The new arrival was a young man with a shock of red hair, a broken nose, and a mouth from which force or the passage of time had removed 3 front teeth. He held on to the edge of the trap and stared up at John. John beamed down at him and shifted his grip on the stick. "Who's here?" he cried. "Historic picture. Old Dr. Cook discovers the North Pole." The red-headed young man blinked. The strong light of the open air was trying to his eyes. "Yous had better come down," he observed coldly. "We've got yous." "And," continued John, unmoved, "is instantly handed a gum-drop by his faithful Eskimo." As he spoke, he brought the stick down on the knuckles which disfigured the edges of the trap. The intruder howled and dropped out of sight. In the passage below there were whisperings and mutterings, growing gradually louder till something resembling coherent conversation came to John's ears, as he knelt by the trap making meditative billiard shots with the stick at a small pebble. "Aw, g'wan, don't be a quitter." "Who's a quitter?" "You's a quitter. Get on top of the roof. He can't hoit yous." "The guy's got a big stick." John nodded appreciatively. "Aye, and Theodore," he murmured. A somewhat baffled silence on the part of the attacking force was followed by further conversation. "Gee, some guy's got to go up." Murmur of assent from the audience. A voice in inspired tones. "Let Sam do it." The suggestion made a hit. There was no doubt about that. It was a success from the start. Quite a little chorus of voices expressed sincere approval of the very happy solution to what had seemed an insoluble problem. John, listening from above, failed to detect in the choir of glad voices one that might belong to Sam himself. Probably gratification had rendered the chosen one dumb. "Yes, let Sam do it," cried the unseen chorus. The first speaker, unnecessarily perhaps, for the motion had been carried almost unanimously, but possibly with the idea of convincing the one member of the party in whose bosom doubts might conceivably be harboured, went on to adduce reasons. "Sam, bein' a coon," he argued, "ain't going to git hoit by no stick. Yous can't hoit a coon by soaking him under cocoa, can ye, Sam?" John waited, with some interest, for the reply, but it did not come. Possibly Sam did not wish to generalize on insufficient experience. "We can but try," said John softly, turning the stick round in his fingers. A report like a cannon sounded in the passage below. It was merely a revolver shot, but in the confined space it was deafening. The bullet sang up into the sky. "Never hit me," said John cheerfully. The noise was succeeded by a shuffling of feet. John grasped his stick more firmly. This was evidently the real attack. The revolver shot had been a mere demonstration of artillery to cover the infantry's advance. Sure enough, the next moment a woolly head popped through the opening, and a pair of rolling eyes gleamed up at him. "Why, Sam," he said cordially, "this is great. Now for our interesting experiment. My idea is that you can hurt a coon's head with a stick, if you hit it hard enough. Keep quite still. Now, what are you coming up, Sam? I hate to do it, but—" A yell rang out. John's theory had been tested and proved correct. By this time the affair had begun to attract spectators. The noise of the revolver had proved a fine advertisement. The roof of the house next door began to fill up. Only a few of the occupants could get a clear view of the proceedings, for the chimney intervened. There was considerable speculation as to what was passing in the 3 Points camp. John was the popular favourite. The early comers had seen his interview with Sam, and were relating it with gusto to their friends. Their attitude toward John was that of a group of men watching a dog at a rat-hole. They looked to him to provide entertainment for them, but they realized that the first move must be with the attackers. They were fair-minded men, and they did not expect John to make any aggressive move. Their indignation, when the proceedings began to grow slow, was directed entirely at the dilatory 3 Pointers. They hooted the 3 Pointers. They urged them to go home and tuck themselves up in bed. The spectators were mostly Irishmen, and it offended them to see what should have been a spirited fight so grossly bungled. "Go on away home, ye quitters!" roared one. A second member of the audience alluded to them as stiffs. It was evident that the besieging army was beginning to grow a little unpopular. More action was needed if they were to retain the esteem of Broster Street. Suddenly there came another and a longer explosion from below, and more bullets wasted themselves on the air. John sighed. "You make me tired," he said. The Irish neighbours expressed the same sentiment in different and more forcible words. There was no doubt about it. As warriors, the 3 Pointers were failing to give satisfaction. A voice from the passage called to John. "Say!" "Well," said John. "Are yous comin' down off of dat roof?" "Would you mind repeating that remark?" "Are yous goin' to quit off out of dat roof?" "Go away and learn some grammar," said John severely. "Hey!" "Well?" "Are yous—" "No, my son," said John. "Since you ask it, I am not. I like being up here. How is Sam?" There was silence below. The time began to pass slowly. The Irishmen on the other roof, now deliberately abandoning hope of further entertainment, proceeded with hoots of derision to climb down, one by one, into the recesses of their own house. And then, from the street far below, there came a fusillade of shots and a babel of shouts and counter-shouts. The roof on the house next door filled again with magical swiftness, and the low wall facing the street became black with the backs of those craning over. There appeared to be great doings in the street. John smiled comfortably. In the army of the corridor, confusion had arisen. A scout, clattering upstairs, had brought the news of the Table Hillites' advent, and there was doubt as to the proper course to pursue. Certain voices urged going down to help the main body. Others pointed out that this would mean abandoning the siege of the roof. The scout who had brought the news was eloquent in favour of the first course. "Gee!" he cried. "Don't I keep tellin' yous that the Table Hills is here? Sure, there's a whole bunch of dem, and unless yous come on down, they'll bite the hull head off of us lot. Leave that stiff on the roof. Let Sam wait here with this canister, and then he can't get down, 'cause Sam'll pump him full of lead while he's beatin' it through the trapdoor. Sure." John nodded reflectively. "There is certainly something in that," he murmured. "I guess the grand rescue scene in the third act has sprung a leak. This will want thinking over." In the street the disturbance had now become terrible. Both sides were hard at it, and the Irishmen on the roof rewarded at last for their long vigil, were yelling encouragement promiscuously and whooping with the unfettered ecstasy of men who are getting the treat of their lives without having paid a penny for it. The behaviour of the New York policeman in affairs of this kind is based on principles of the soundest practical wisdom. The unthinking man would rush in and attempt to crush the combat in its earliest and fiercest stages. The New York policeman, knowing the importance of his safety and the insignificance of the gangsman's, permits the opposing forces to hammer each other into a certain distaste for battle, and then, when both sides have begun to have enough of it, rushes in himself and clubs everything in sight. It is an admirable process in its results, but it is sure rather than swift. Proceedings in the affair below had not yet reached the police interference stage. The noise, what with the shots and yells from the street and the ear-piercing approval of the roof audience, was just working up to a climax. John rose. He was tired of kneeling by the trap, and there was no likelihood of Sam making another attempt to climb through. He got up and stretched himself. And then he saw that Betty was standing beside him, holding with each hand a small and, by Broster Street standards, uncannily clean child. The children were scared and whimpering, and she stooped to soothe them. Then she turned to John, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Are you hurt?" she cried. "What has been happening? Are you hurt?" John's heart leaped at the anxious break in her voice. "It's all right," he said soothingly. "It's absolutely all right. Everything's over." As if to give him the lie, the noise in the street swelled to a crescendo of yells and shots. "What's that?" cried Betty, starting. "I fancy," said John, "the police must be taking a hand. It's all right. There's a little trouble down below there between two of the gangs. It won't last long now." "Who were those men?" "My friends in the passage," he said lightly. "Those were some of the 3 Points gang. We were holding the concluding exercise of a rather lively campaign that's been—" Betty leaned weakly against the chimney. There was silence now in the street. Only the distant rumble of an elevated train broke the stillness. She drew her hands from the children's grasp and covered her face. As she lowered them again, John saw that the blood had left her cheeks. She was white and shaking. He moved forward impulsively. "Betty!" She tottered, reaching blindly for the chimney for support, and without further words he gathered her into his arms as if she had been the child she looked, and held her there, clutching her to him fiercely, kissing the brown hair that brushed against his face, and soothing her with vague murmurings. Her breath came in broken gasps. She laughed hysterically. "I thought they were killing you, and I couldn't leave my babies. They were so frightened, poor little mites. I thought they were killing you." "Betty!" Her arms about his neck tightened their grip convulsively, forcing his head down until his face rested against hers. And so they stood, rigid, while the two children stared with round eyes and whimpered unheeded. Her grip relaxed. Her hands dropped slowly to her side. She leaned back against the circle of his arms and looked up at him, a strange look, full of sweet humility. "I thought I was strong," she said quietly. "I'm weak, but I don't care." He looked at her with glowing eyes, not understanding, but content that the journey was ended, that she was there in his arms, speaking to him. "I always loved you, dear," she went on. "You knew that, didn't you? But I thought I was strong enough to give you up for a principle. But I was wrong. I can't do without you. I knew it just now when I saw—" She stopped and shuddered. "I can't do without you," she repeated. She felt the muscles of his arms quiver, and pressed more closely against them. They were strong arms, protecting arms, restful to lean against at the journey's end. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A lemon. That bulwark of peaceful moments, Pugsy Maloney, was rather the man of action than the man of tact. Otherwise, when, a moment later, he thrust his head up through the trap, he would have withdrawn delicately, and not split the silence with a raucous "Hey!" which acted on John and Betty like an electric shock. John glowered at him. Betty was pink, but composed. Pugsy climbed leisurely onto the roof and surveyed the group. "Why, hello!" he said, as he saw Betty more closely. "Well, Pugsy," said Betty, "how are you?" John turned in surprise. "Do you know Pugsy?" Betty looked at him, puzzled. "Why, of course I do." "Sure," said Pugsy. "Miss Brown was stenographer on de poiper till she beat it." "Miss Brown?" There was utter bewilderment in John's face. "I changed my name when I went to Peaceful Moments." "Then did you—" "Yes, I wrote those articles. That's how I happened to be here now. I come down every day and help look after the babies. Poor little souls. There seems to be nobody else here who has time to do it. It's dreadful. Some of them, you wouldn't believe. I don't think they could ever have had a real bath in their lives." "Baths is foolishness," commented Master Maloney austerely, eyeing the scoured infants with a touch of disfavour. John was reminded of a second mystery that needed solution. "How on earth did you get up here, Pugsy?" he asked. "How did you get past Sam?" "Sam? I didn't see no Sam. Who's Sam?" "One of those fellows, a coon. They left him on guard with a gun, so that I shouldn't get down." "I met a coon beatin' it down the stairs. I guess dat was him. I guess he got cold feet." "Then there's nothing to stop us from getting down." "Nope, dat's right. Der ain't a tree-pointer within a mile. The cops have been loadin' dem into de patrol wagon by de dozen." John turned to Betty. "We'll go and have dinner somewhere. You haven't begun to explain things yet." Betty shook her head with a smile. "I haven't got time to go out to dinners," she said. "I'm a working girl. I'm cashier at Fontelli's Italian restaurant. I shall be on duty in another half hour." John was aghast. "You?" "It's a very good situation," said Betty demurely. $6 a week, and what I steal. I haven't stolen anything yet, and I think Mr. Jarvis is a little disappointed in me. But, of course, I haven't settled down properly." "Jarvis? That Jarvis?" "Yes, he has been very good to me. He got me this place, and has looked after me all the time." "I'll buy him 1,000 cats," said John fervently. "But, Betty, you mustn't go there any more. You must quit. "If Peaceful Moments would re-engage me," said Betty. She spoke lightly, but her face was serious. "Dear," she said quickly, I can't be away from you now while there's danger. I couldn't bear it. Will you let me come?" He hesitated. "You will. You must." Her manner changed again. "That's settled, then. Pugsy, I'm coming back to the paper. Are you glad?" "Sure ting," said Pugsy. "You're to the good." "And now," she went on, "I must give these babies back to their mothers, and then I'll come with you." She lowered herself through the trap, and John handed the children down to her. Pugsy looked on, smoking a thoughtful cigarette. John drew a deep breath. Pugsy, removing the cigarette from his mouth, delivered himself of a stately word of praise. "She's a boyd," he said. "Pugsy," said John, feeling in his pocket and producing a roll of bills, $1 a word is our rate for contributions like that." John pushed back his chair slightly, stretched out his legs, and lighted a cigarette, watching Betty fondly through the smoke. The resources of the Knickerbocker Hotel had proved equal to supplying the staff of Peaceful Moments with an excellent dinner, and John had stoutly declined to give or listen to any explanations until the coffee arrived. "Thousands of promising careers," he said, "have been ruined by the fatal practice of talking seriously at dinner. But now we might begin." Betty looked at him across the table with shining eyes. It was good to be together again. "My explanations won't take long," she said. "I ran away from you, and when you found me, I ran away again." "But I didn't find you," objected John. "That was my trouble." "But my aunt told you I was at Peaceful Moments." "On the contrary, I didn't even know you had not." "Well, she's not exactly that. She's my stepfather's aunt, Mrs. Oakley. I was certain you had gone straight to her, and that she had told you where I was." "The Mrs. Oakley, the philanthropist?" "Don't laugh at her," said Betty quickly. "She was so good to me." "She passes," said John decidedly. "And now," said Betty, "it's your turn." John lighted another cigarette. "My story," he said, "is rather longer. When they threw me out of Mervo—" "What?" "I'm afraid you don't keep abreast of European history," he said. "Haven't you heard of the great revolution in Mervo, and the overthrow of the dynasty? Bloodless, but invigorating. The populace rose against me as one man, except good old General Poineau. He was for me, and Crump was neutral, but apart from them my subjects were unanimous. There's a republic again in Mervo now." "But why? What had you done?" "Well, I abolished the gaming tables. But more probably," he went on quickly, "they saw what a perfect dub I was in every—" She interrupted him. "Do you mean to say that just because of me?" "Well," he said awkwardly, "as a matter of fact, what you said did make me think over my position, and of course, directly I thought it over— Oh, well, anyway, I closed down gambling in Mervo, and then—" "John!" He was aware of a small hand creeping round the table under cover of the cloth. He pressed it swiftly, and looking round, caught the eye of a hovering waiter, who swooped like a respectful hawk. "Did you want anything, sir?" "I've got it, thanks," said John. The waiter moved away. "Well, directly they had fired me, I came over here. I don't know what I expected to do. I suppose I thought I might find you by chance. I pretty soon saw how hopeless it was, and it struck me that if I didn't get some work to do mighty quick, I shouldn't be much good to anyone else except the alienists." Dear. The waiter stared, but John's eyes stopped him in mid-swoop. Then I found Smith. Where is Mr. Smith? In prison, said John with a chuckle. In prison? He resisted and assaulted the police. I'll tell you about it later. Well, Smith told me of the alterations in Peaceful Moments, and I saw that it was just the thing for me. And it has occupied my mind quite some. To think of you being the writer of those Broster Street articles. You certainly have started something, Betty. Goodness knows where it will end. I hoped to have brought off a coup this afternoon, but the arrival of Sam and his friends just spoiled it. This afternoon? Yes, why were you there? What were you doing? I was interviewing the collector of rents and trying to dig his employer's name out of him. It was Smith's idea. Smith's theory was that the owner of the tenements must have some special private reason for lying low, and that he would employ some special fellow whom he could trust as a rent collector. And I'm pretty certain he was right. I cornered the collector, a little rabbit-faced man named Gooch, and I believe he was on the point of... What's the matter? Betty's forehead was wrinkled. Her eyes wore a far-away expression. I'm trying to remember something. I seem to know the name Gooch, and I seem to associate it with a little rabbit-faced man, and... Quick, tell me some more about him. He's just hovering about on the edge of my memory. Quick, push him in. John threw his mind back to the interview in the dark passage, trying to reconstruct it. He's small, he said slowly. His eyes protrude, so do his teeth. Yes, I remember now, he has a curious red mark on his right cheek, said Betty triumphantly. By Jove, cried John, you've got him? I remember him perfectly. He was... She stopped with a little gasp. Yes? John, he was one of my stepfather's secretaries, she said. They looked at each other in silence. It can't be, said John at length. It can. It is. He must be. He has scores of interests everywhere. He prides himself on it. It's the most natural thing. John shook his head doubtfully. But why all the fuss? Your stepfather isn't the man to mind public opinion. But don't you see? It's as Mr. Smith said. The private reason. It's as clear as daylight. Naturally, he would do anything rather than be found out, don't you see, because of Mrs. Oakley. Because of Mrs. Oakley? You don't know her as I do. She is a curious mixture. She's double-natured. You called her the philanthropist just now. Well, she would be one if she could bear to part with money. Yes, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's so. She is mean about money, but she honestly hates to hear of anybody treating poor people badly. If my stepfather were really the owner of those tenements, and she should find it out, she would have nothing more to do with him. It's true. I know her. The smile passed away from John's face. By George, he said, it certainly begins to hang together. I know I'm right. I think you are. He sat meditating for a moment. Well, he said at last, what do you mean? I mean, what are we going to do? Do we go on with this? Go on with it? I don't understand. I mean, well, it has become rather a family matter, you see. Do you feel as warlike against Mr. Scobell as you did against an unknown lessee? Betty's eyes sparkled. I don't think I should feel any different if it was you, she said. I've been spending days and days in those houses, John dear, and I've seen such utter squalor and misery, where there needn't be any at all, if only the owner would do his duty, and she stopped. Her eyes were misty. Thumbs down, in fact, said John, nodding. I'm with you. As he spoke, two men came down the broad staircase into the grill room. Betty's back was towards them, but John saw them and stared. "What are you looking at?" asked Betty. "Will you count 10 before looking round?" "What is it?" "Your stepfather has just come in." "What?" "He's sitting directly behind you. Count 10." But Betty had twisted round in her chair. "Where? Where?" "Just where you're looking. Don't let him see you." "I don't. Oh!" "Got him?" He leaned back in his chair. "The plot thickens, eh?" he said. "What is Mr. Scobell doing in New York, I wonder, if he has not come to keep an eye on his interests?" Betty had whipped round again. Her face was white with excitement. "It's true," she whispered. "I was right. Do you see who that is with him, the man?" "Do you know him? He's a stranger to me." "It's Mr. Parker," said Betty. John drew in a sharp breath. "Are you sure?" "Positive." John laughed quietly. He thought for a moment, then beckoned the hovering waiter. "What are you going to do?" asked Betty. "Bring me a small lemon," said John. "Lemon squash, sir?" "Not a lemon squash, a plain lemon, the fruit of that name. The common or garden citron, which is sharp to the taste and not pleasant to have handed to one. Also a piece of note paper, a little tissue paper, and an envelope." "What are you going to do?" asked Betty. John beamed. "Did you ever read the Sherlock Holmes story entitled 'The 5 Orange Pips'? Well, when a man in that story received a mysterious envelope containing 5 orange pips, it was a sign that he was due to get his. It was all over, as far as he was concerned, except phoning for the undertaker. I propose to treat Mr. Scobell better than that. He shall have the whole lemon." The waiter returned. John wrapped up the lemon carefully, wrote on the note paper the words, "To B. Scobell, Esquire, property owner, Broster Street. From Prince John, of Peaceful Moments, this gift," and enclosed it in the envelope. "Do you see that gentleman at the table by the pillar?" he said. "Give him these. Just say a gentleman sent them." The waiter smiled doubtfully. John added a $2 bill to the collection in his hand. "You needn't give him that," he said. The waiter smiled again, but this time not doubtfully. "And now," said John, as the messenger ambled off, "perhaps it would be just as well if we retired." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The final attempt. Proof that his shot had not missed its mark was supplied to John immediately upon his arrival at the office on the following morning, when he was met by Pugsy Maloney with the information that a gentleman had called to see him. "With or without a blackjack?" enquired John. "Did he give any name?" "Sure. Parker's his name. He blew in once before when Mr. Smith was here. I loosed him into the outer room." John walked through. The man he had seen with Mr. Scobell at the Knickerbocker was standing at the window. "Mr. Parker?" The other turned as the door opened and looked at him keenly. "Are you Mr. Maude?" "I am," said John. "I guess you don't need to be told what I've come about." "No." "See here," said Mr. Parker, "I don't know how you've found things out, but you've done it, and we're through. We quit." "I'm glad of that," said John. "Would you mind informing Spider Riley of that fact? It will make life pleasanter for all of us." "Mr. Scobell sent me along here to ask you to come and talk over this thing with him. He's at the Knickerbocker. I've a cab waiting outside. Can you come along?" "I'd rather he came here." "And I bet he'd rather come here than be where he is. That little surprise packet of yours last night put him down and out. Gave him a stroke of some sort. He's in bed now, with half a dozen doctors working on him." John thought for a moment. "Oh," he said slowly, "if it's that, very well." He could not help feeling a touch of remorse. He had no reason to be fond of Mr. Scobell, but he was sorry that this should have happened. They went out to the street. A taximeter cab was standing by the sidewalk. They got in. Neither spoke. John was thoughtful and preoccupied. Mr. Parker, too, appeared to be absorbed in his own thoughts. He sat with folded arms and lowered head. The cab buzzed up Fifth Avenue. Suddenly something, half seen through the window, brought John to himself with a jerk. It was the great white mass of the Plaza Hotel. The next moment he saw that they were abreast of the park, and for the first time an icy wave of suspicion swept over him. "Here, what's this?" he cried. "Where are you taking me?" Mr. Parker's right hand came swiftly out of ambush, and something gleamed in the sun. "Don't move," said Mr. Parker. The hard nozzle of a pistol pressed against John's chest. "Keep that hand still." John dropped his hand. Mr. Parker leaned back, with the pistol resting easily on his knee. The cab began to move more quickly. John's mind was in a whirl. His chief emotion was not fear, but disgust that he should have allowed himself to be trapped with such absurd ease. He blushed for himself. Mr. Parker's face was expressionless, but who could say what tumults of silent laughter were not going on inside him? John bit his lip. "Well?" he said at last. Mr. Parker did not reply. "Well?" said John again. "What's the next move?" It flashed across his mind that, unless driven to it by an attack, his captor would do nothing for the moment without running grave risks himself. To shoot now would be to attract attention. The cab would be overtaken at once by bicycle police and stopped. There would be no escape. No, nothing could happen till they reached open country. At least he would have time to think this matter over in all its bearings. Mr. Parker ignored the question. He was sitting in the same attitude of watchfulness, the revolver resting on his knee. He seemed mistrustful of John's right hand, which was hanging limply at his side. It was from this quarter that he appeared to expect attack. The cab was bowling easily up the broad street, past rows and rows of high houses, each looking exactly the same as the last. Occasionally, to the right, through a break in a line of buildings, a glimpse of the river could be seen. A faint hope occurred to John that, by talking, he might put the other off his guard for just that instant, which was all he asked. He exerted himself to find material for conversation. "Tell me," he said, What you said about Mr. Scobell, was that true? About his being ill in bed?" Mr. Parker did not answer, but a wintry smile flittered across his face. "It was not? Well, I'm glad of that. I don't wish Mr. Scobell any harm." Mr. Parker looked at him doubtfully. "Say, why are you in this game at all?" he said. "What made you butt in?" "One must do something," said John. "It's interesting work." "If you'll quit?" John shook his head. "I own it's a tempting proposition, things being as they are, but I won't give up yet. You never know what may happen." "Well, you can make a mighty near guess this trip." "You can't do a thing yet, that's sure," said John confidently. "If you shot me now, the cab would be stopped, and you would be lynched by the populace. I seem to see them tearing you limb from limb. 'She loves me,' off comes an arm. 'She loves me not,' a leg joins the little heap on the ground. That is what would happen, Mr. Parker." The other shrugged his shoulders, and relapsed into silence once more. "What are you going to do with me, Mr. Parker?" asked John. Mr. Parker did not reply. The cab moved swiftly on. Now they had reached the open country. An occasional wooden shack was passed, but that was all. At any moment, John felt, the climax of the drama might be reached, and he got ready. His muscles stiffened for a spring. There was little chance of its being effective, but at least it would be good to put up some kind of a fight. And he had a faint hope that the suddenness of his movement might upset the other's arm. He was bound to be hit somewhere, that was certain, but quickness might save him to some extent. He braced his leg against the back of the cab, and as he did so, its smooth speed changed to a series of jarring jumps, each more emphatic than the last. It slowed down, then came to a halt. There was a thud as the chauffeur jumped down. John heard him fumbling in the toolbox. Presently the body of the machine was raised slightly as he got to work with the jack. John's muscles relaxed. He leaned back. Surely something could be made of this new development. But the hand that held the revolver never wavered. He paused, irresolute, and at the moment somebody spoke in the road outside. "Had a breakdown?" enquired the voice. John recognized it. It was the voice of Kid Brady. The Kid, as he had stated that he intended to do, had begun his training for his match with Eddie Wood at White Plains. It was his practice to open a course of training with a little gentle road work, and it was while jogging along the highway a couple of miles from his training camp, in company with the two thick-necked gentlemen who acted as his sparring partners, that he had come upon the broken-down taxicab. If this had happened after his training had begun in real earnest, he would have averted his eyes from the spectacle, however alluring, and continued on his way without pause. But now, as he had not yet settled down to genuine hard work, he felt justified in turning aside and looking into the matter. The fact that the chauffeur, who seemed to be a taciturn man lacking the conversational graces, manifestly objected to an audience, deterred him not at all. One cannot have everything in this world, and the Kid and his attendant thicknecks were content to watch the process of mending the tire without demanding the additional joy of sparkling small talk from the man in charge of the operations. "Guy's had a breakdown, sure," said the first of the thicknecks. "Surest thing you know," agreed his colleague. "Seems to me the tire's punctured," said the Kid. All three concentrated their gaze on the machine. "Kid's right," said thickneck number one. Guy's been and busted a tire. Sure thing you know, said Thick-neck number 2. They observed the perspiring chauffeur in silence for a while. Wonder how he did that now, speculated the kid. Ran over a nail, I guess, said Thick-neck number 1. Surest thing you know, said the other, who, while perhaps somewhat deficient in the matter of original thought, was a most useful fellow to have by one, a sort of Boswell. Did you run over a nail? The kid enquired of the chauffeur. The chauffeur worked on, unheeding. This is his busy day, said the first Thick-neck with satire. Guy's too full of work to talk to us. Deaf, I shouldn't wonder, surmised the kid. Say, wonder what he's doing with the taxi so far out of the city. Some guy tells him to drive out here, I guess. Say, it'll cost him some, too. He'll have to strip off a few from his roll to pay for this. John glanced at Mr. Parker, quivering with excitement. It was his last chance. Would the kid think to look inside the cab, or would he move on? Could he risk a shout? Mr. Parker leaned forward and thrust the muzzle of the pistol against his body. The possibilities of the situation had evidently not been lost upon him. Keep quiet, he whispered. Outside, the conversation had begun again, and the kid had made his decision. Pretty rich guy inside, he said, following up his companion's train of thought. I'm going to rubber through the window. John met Mr. Parker's eye and smiled. There came the sound of the kid's feet grating on the road as he turned, and, as he heard it, Mr. Parker, for the first time, lost his head. With a vague idea of screening John, he half rose. The pistol wavered. It was the chance John had prayed for. His left hand shot out, grasped the other's wrist, and gave it a sharp wrench. The pistol went off with a deafening report, the bullet passing through the back of the cab, then fell to the floor as the fingers lost their hold, and the next moment John's right fist, darting upward, crashed home. The effect was instantaneous. John had risen from his seat as he delivered the blow, and it got the full benefit of his weight. Mr. Parker literally crumpled up. His head jerked, then fell limply forward. John pushed him onto the seat as he slid to the floor. The interested face of the kid appeared at the window. Behind him could be seen portions of the faces of the 2 Thick-necks. "Hello, kid," said John. "I heard your voice. I hoped you might look in for a chat." The kid stared, amazed. "What's doing?" he queried. "A good deal. I'll explain later. First, will you kindly knock that chauffeur down and sit on his head?" "The guy's beat it," volunteered the first Thick-neck. "Surest thing you know," said the other. "What's been doing?" asked the kid. "What are you going to do with this guy?" John inspected the prostrate Mr. Parker, who had begun to stir slightly. "I guess we'll leave him here," he said. "I've had all of his company that I need for today. Show me the nearest station, kid. I must be getting back to New York. I'll tell you all about it as we go. A walk will do me good. Riding in a taxi is pleasant, but believe me, you can have too much of it." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A representative gathering. When John returned to the office, he found that his absence had been causing Betty an anxious hour's waiting. She had been informed by Pugsy that he had gone out in the company of Mr. Parker, and she felt uneasy. She turned white at his story of the ride, but he minimized the dangers. I don't think he ever meant to shoot. I think he was going to shut me up somewhere out there and keep me till I promised to be good. Do you think my stepfather told him to do it? I doubt it. I fancy Parker is a man who acts a good deal on his own inspirations. But we'll ask him when he calls today. Is he going to call? I have an idea that he will, said John. I sent him a note just now, asking if he could manage a visit. It was unfortunate, in the light of subsequent events, that Mr. Jarvis should have seen fit to bring with him to the office that afternoon 2 of his collection of cats, and that long Otto, who, as before, accompanied him, should have been fired by his example to the extent of introducing a large yellow dog. Before the afternoon was ended, space in the office was destined to be at a premium. Mr. Jarvis, when he had recovered from the surprise of seeing Betty, and learning that she had returned to her old situation, explained. "Thought I'd bring the kits along," he said. "They starts fussin' with each other the other day, so I brings them along." John inspected the menagerie without resentment. "Sure," he said, "they add a kind of peaceful touch to the scene." The atmosphere was indeed one of peace. The dog, after an inquisitive journey round the room, lay down and went to sleep. The cats settled themselves comfortably, one on each of Mr. Jarvis's knees. Long Otto, surveying the ceiling with his customary glassy stare, smoked a long cigar, and Bat, scratching one of the cats under the ear, began to entertain John with some reminiscences of Fitz and kittens. But the peace did not last. 10 minutes had barely elapsed when the dog, sitting up with a start, uttered a whine. The door burst open, and a man dashed in. He was brown in the face, and had evidently been living recently in the open air. Behind him was a crowd of uncertain numbers. They were all strangers to John. "Yes?" he said. The little man glared speechlessly at the occupants of the room. The 2 Bowery boys rose awkwardly. The cats fell to the floor. The rest of the party had entered. Betty recognized the Reverend Edwin T. Philpotts and Mr. B. Henderson Asher. "My name is Renshaw," said the little man, having found speech. "What can I do for you?" The question appeared to astound the other. "What can you, of all—" "Mr. Renshaw is the editor of Peaceful Moments," she said. "Mr. Smith was only acting for him." Mr. Renshaw caught the name. "Yes, Mr. Smith. I want to see Mr. Smith. Where is he?" "In prison," said John. "In prison?" John nodded. "A good many things have happened since you left for your vacation. Smith assaulted a policeman and is now on Blackwell's Island." Mr. Renshaw gasped. Mr. B. Henderson Asher stared and stumbled over the cat. "And who are you?" asked the editor. "My name is Maud. He broke off to turn his attention to Mr. Jarvis and Mr. Asher, between whom unpleasantness seemed to have arisen. Mr. Jarvis, holding a cat in his arms, was scowling at Mr. Asher, who had backed away and appeared apprehensive. "What is the trouble?" asked John. "This guy here with 2 left feet," said Bat querulously, "treads on the kit." Mr. Renshaw, eyeing Bat and the silent Otto with disgust, intervened. "Who are these persons?" he inquired. "Poison yourself," rejoined Bat, justly incensed. "Who's the little squirt, Mr. Maud?" John waved his hands. Gentlemen, he said, why descend to mere personalities? I ought to have introduced you. This is Mr. Renshaw, our editor. These, Mr. Renshaw, are Bat Jarvis and Long Otto, acting fighting editors, Vice Kid Brady, absent on unavoidable business. The name stung Mr. Renshaw to indignation, as Smith's had done. "Brady," he shrilled, "I insist that you give me a full explanation. I go away by my doctor's orders for a vacation, leaving Mr. Smith to conduct the paper on certain clearly defined lines. By mere chance, while on my vacation, I saw a copy of the paper. It had been ruined." "Ruined?" said John. "On the contrary. Who is this person Brady?" "With Mr. Philpotts, I have been going carefully over the numbers which have been issued since my departure." "An intellectual treat," murmured John. "And in each there is a picture of this young man in a costume which I will not particularize. There is hardly enough of it to particularize. Together with a page of disgusting autobiographical matter." John held up his hand. "I protest," he said. "We court criticism, but this is mere abuse. I appeal to these gentlemen to say whether this, for instance, is not bright and interesting." He picked up the current number of Peaceful Moments and turned to the Kid's page. "This," he said, "describes a certain 10-round unpleasantness with one Mexican Joe. Joe comes up for the second round, and he gives me a nasty look. But I thinks of my mother and swats him one in the lower ribs. He gives me another nasty look. 'All right, kid,' he says. 'Now I'll knock you up into the gallery.' And with that he cuts loose with a right swing, but I falls into the clinch, and then—" "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Renshaw. "Go on, boss," urged Mr. Jarvis approvingly. "It's tooty good, dat stuff." "There," said John triumphantly. "You heard? Mr. Jarvis, one of the most firmly established critics east of Fifth Avenue, stamps Kid Brady's reminiscences with the hallmark of his approval." "I falls for the kid every time," assented Mr. Jarvis. "Sure, you know a good thing when you see one. Why," he went on warmly, "there is stuff in these reminiscences which would stir the blood of a jellyfish. Let me quote you another passage, to show that they are not only enthralling, but helpful as well. Let me see, where is it? Ah, I have it. A bully good way of putting a guy out of business is this. You don't want to use it in the ring, because rightly speaking it's a foul, but you will find it mighty useful if any thick-neck comes up to you in the street and tries to start anything. It's this way. While he's setting himself for a punch, just place the tips of the fingers of your left hand on the right side of the chest, then bring down the heel of your left hand. There isn't a guy living that could stand up against that. The fingers give you a leverage to beat the man. The guy doubles up, and you uppercut him with your right, and out he goes. Now, I bet you never knew that before, Mr. Philpotts. Try it on your parishioners." "Peaceful Moments," said Mr. Renshaw irately, "is no medium for exploiting low prize-fighters." "Low prize-fighters? No, no. The kid is as decent a little chap as you'll meet anywhere. And right up in the championship class, too. He's matched against Eddie Wood at this very moment. And Mr. Waterman will support me in my statement that a victory over Eddie Wood means that he gets a cast-iron claim to meet Jimmy Garvin for the championship." "It is abominable," burst forth Mr. Renshaw. "It is disgraceful. The paper is ruined." "You keep saying that. It really isn't so. The returns are excellent. Prosperity beams on us like a sun. The proprietor is more than satisfied." "Indeed," said Mr. Renshaw sardonically. "Sure," said John. Mr. Renshaw laughed an acid laugh.
"You may not know it," he said, "but Mr. Scobell is in New York at this very moment. We arrived together yesterday on the Mauretania. I was spending my vacation in England when I happened to see a copy of the paper. I instantly communicated with Mr. Scobell, who was at Mervo, an island in the Mediterranean. I seem to know the name, and received in reply a long cable desiring me to return to New York immediately. I sailed on the Mauretania and found that he was one of the passengers. He was extremely agitated, let me tell you, so that your impudent assertion that the proprietor is pleased—" John raised his eyebrows. "I don't quite understand," he said. "From what you say, one would almost imagine that you thought Mr. Scobell was the proprietor of this paper." Mr. Renshaw stared. Everyone stared, except Mr. Jarvis, who, since readings from the Kid's reminiscences had ceased, had lost interest in the proceedings, and was now entertaining the cats with a ball of paper tied to a string. "Thought that Mr. Scobell," repeated Renshaw. "Who is, if he is not?" "I am," said John. There was a moment's absolute silence. "You?" cried Mr. Renshaw. "You?" exclaimed Mr. Waterman, Mr. Asher, and the Reverend Edwin T. Philpotts. "Sure thing," said John. Mr. Renshaw groped for a chair and sat down. "Am I going mad?" he demanded feebly. "Do I understand you to say that you own this paper?" "I do." "Since when?" "Roughly speaking, about 3 days." Among his audience, still excepting Mr. Jarvis, who was tickling one of the cats and whistling a plaintive melody, there was a tendency toward awkward silence. To start assailing a seeming nonentity, and then to discover he is the proprietor of the paper to which you wish to contribute, is like kicking an apparently empty hat and finding your rich uncle inside it. Mr. Renshaw, in particular, was disturbed. Editorships of the kind to which he aspired are not easy to get. If he were to be removed from Peaceful Moments, he would find it hard to place himself anywhere else. Editors, like manuscripts, are rejected from want of space. "I had a little money to invest," continued John, "and it seemed to me that I couldn't do better than putting it into Peaceful Moments. If it did nothing else, it would give me a free hand in pursuing a policy in which I was interested. Smith told me that Mr. Scobell's representatives had instructions to accept any offer. So I made an offer, and they jumped at it." Pugsy Maloney entered, bearing a card. "Ask him to wait just one moment," said John, reading it. He turned to Mr. Renshaw. "Mr. Renshaw," he said, "if you took hold of the paper again, helped by these other gentlemen, do you think you could gather in our old subscribers and generally make the thing a live proposition on the old lines? Because, if so, I should be glad if you would start in with the next number. I am through with the present policy. At least, I hope to be in a few minutes. Do you think you can undertake that?" Mr. Renshaw, with a sigh of relief, intimated that he could. "Good," said John. "And now I'm afraid I must ask you to go. A rather private and delicate interview is in the offing. Bat, I'm very much obliged to you and Otto for your help. I don't know what we should have done without you." "Aw, gee," said Mr. Jarvis. "Then good-bye for the present." "Good-bye, boss. Good-bye, Lloydie." Long Otto pulled his forelock, and, accompanied by the cats and the dog, they left the room. When Mr. Renshaw and the others had followed them, John rang the bell for Pugsy. "Ask Mr. Scobell to step in," he said. The man of many enterprises entered. His appearance had deteriorated since John had last met him. He had the air of one who has been caught in the machinery. His face was even sallower than of yore, and there was no gleam in his dull green eyes. He started at the sight of Betty, but he was evidently too absorbed in the business in hand to be surprised at seeing her. He sank into a chair and stared gloomily at John. "Well?" he said. "Well," said John. "This," observed Mr. Scobell simply, "is hell." He drew a cigar stump mechanically from his vest pocket and lighted it. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked. "What are you?" said John. "It's up to you." Mr. Scobell gazed heavily into vacancy. "Ever since I started in to monkey with that darned Mervo," he said sadly, "there ain't a thing gone right. I haven't been able to turn around without bumping into myself. Everything I touch turns to mud. I guess I can still breathe, but I'm not betting on that lasting long. Of all the darned hoodoos, that island was the worst. Say, I gotta close down that casino. What do you know about that? Sure thing. The old lady won't stand for it. I had a letter from her." He turned to Betty. "You got her all worked up, Betty. I'm not blaming you. It's just my jinx. She took it into her head I'd been treating you mean, and she kicked at the casino. I gotta close it down or nix on the air thing. That was enough for me. I'm going to turn it into a hotel." He relighted his cigar. "And now, just as I got her smoothed down, along comes this darned tenement business. Say, Prince, for the love of Mike, cut it out. If those houses are as bad as you say they are, and the old lady finds out that I own them, it'll be Katy bar the door for me. She wouldn't stand for it for a moment. I guess I didn't treat you good, Prince, but let's forget it. Ease up on this rough stuff. I'll do anything you want." Betty spoke. "We only want you to make the houses fit to live in," she said. "I don't believe you know what they're like." "Why, no. I left Parker in charge. It was up to him to do what was wanted. Say, Prince, I want to talk to you about that guy Parker. I understand he's been rather rough with you and your crowd. That wasn't my doing. I didn't know anything about it till he told me. It's the darned Wild West strain in him coming out. He used to do those sort of things out there, and he's forgotten his manners. I pay him well, and I guess he thinks that's the way it's up to him to earn it. You mustn't mind, Parker." "Oh, well, so long as he means well," said John. "I've no grudge against Parker. I've settled with him." "Well, then, what about this Broster Street thing? You want me to fix some improvements, is that it?" "That's it." "Why, say, I'll do that, sure. And then you'll quit handing out the newspaper stories? That goes. I'll start right in." He rose. "That's taken a heap off my mind," he said. "There's just one other thing," said John. "Have you, by any chance, such a thing as a stepfather's blessing on you?" "Eh?" John took Betty's hand. "We've come round to your views, Mr. Scobell," he said. "That scheme of yours for our future looks good to us." Mr. Scobell bit through his cigar in his emotion. "Now, why the heck," he moaned, "couldn't you have had the sense to do that before and save all this trouble?" End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusion. Smith drew thoughtfully at his cigar and shifted himself more comfortably into his chair. It was long since he had visited the West, and he had found all the old magic in the still, scented darkness of the prairie night. He gave a little sigh of content. When John, a year before, had announced his intention of buying this ranch, and, as it seemed to Smith, burying himself alive 1,000 miles from anywhere, he had disapproved. He had pointed out that John was not doing what fate expected of him. A miracle, in the shape of a 6-figure wedding present from Mrs. Oakley, who had never been known before in the memory of man to give away 1/1,000,000th of that sum, had happened to him. Fate, argued Smith, plainly intended him to stay in New York and spend his money in a civilized way. John had had only one reply, but it was clinching. "Betty likes the idea," he said, and Smith ceased to argue. Now, as he sat smoking on the porch on the first night of his inaugural visit to the ranch, a conviction was creeping over him that John had chosen wisely. A door opened behind him. Betty came out onto the porch and dropped into a chair close to where John's cigar glowed redly in the darkness. They sat there without speaking. The stirring of unseen cattle in the corral made a soothing accompaniment to thought. "It is very pleasant for an old jailbird like myself," said Smith at last, "to sit here at my ease. I wish all our absent friends could be with us tonight, or perhaps not quite all. Let us say, Comrade Parker here, Comrades Brady and Maloney over there by you, and our old friend Renshaw sharing the floor with B. Henderson Asher, Bat Jarvis, and the cats. By the way, I was round at Broster Street before I left New York. There is certainly an improvement. Millionaires now stop there instead of going on to the plaza. Are you asleep, John?" "No." "Excellent. I also saw Comrade Brady before I left. He has definitely got on his match with Jimmy Garvin." "Good. He'll win." "The papers seem to think so. Peaceful Moments, however, I am sorry to say, is silent on the subject. It was not like this in the good old days. How is the paper going now, John? Are the receipts satisfactory?" "Pretty fair. Renshaw is rather a marvel in his way. He seems to have roped in nearly all the old subscribers. They eat out of his hand." Smith stretched himself. "These," he said, "are the moments in life to which we look back with that wistful pleasure. This peaceful scene, John, will remain with me when I have forgotten that such a man as Spider Riley ever existed. These are the real peaceful moments." He closed his eyes. The cigar dropped from his fingers. There was a long silence. "Mr. Smith?" said Betty. There was no answer. "He's asleep," said John. "He had a long journey today." Betty drew her chair closer. From somewhere out in the darkness, from the direction of the men's quarters, came the soft tinkle of a guitar and a voice droning a Mexican love song. Her hand stole out and found his. They began to talk in whispers. End of chapter 30, and end of The Prince and Betty by P.G. Wodehouse. Recording by Kirsten Wever.